Welcome back to our channel. We want to thank you for watching. In this episode, we are looking on why Macron's crusade to renew France's role in Africa has failed. The French president promised decisive improvement in Francophone African relations, but his misunderstanding of the stakes involved and the method needed have meant total failure. Moving forward, the promises sounded great, sometimes generous, bordering on naive, but with time, they shattered on the implacable reality of a France-Afrique relationship that proves difficult to transform. And so it was that at the end of his first term.
We begin in Niger, where a group of military officers has announced a coup on national television. They said they've dissolved the constitution in the West African country, suspended all institutions and closed the country's borders.
This day, July 23rd, 2023, we, the Defense and Security Forces, meeting within the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, have decided to put an end to the regime you know. This follows the continuing deterioration of the security situation and poor economic and social governance.
Well, army officers in Burkina Faso have announced the overthrow of military leader Paul-Henri Damiba. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has been declared the new head of the West African country.
Army officers addressed the nation. The national television broadcast ended doubts over who's now in charge. The military leaders had overthrown their own lieutenant-turned-president and promised to tackle the volatile security situation.
We have decided, after taking the president who is with us now, to dissolve the current constitution. We also decided to dissolve the government, to close the land and air borders.
President Emmanuel Macron, who had promised definitive upheavals in France's African relations, had to content himself with very conventional relations with his main partners, who were reluctant to let themselves be carried away by the ephemeral enthusiasm of a head of state who was mistaken as much about the stakes as about the method. The return to the starting point is all the more painful for Macron as it occurs in a situation in which France is forced to admit that it is no longer has the means of its ambitions and that it is losing grounds even in the traditional sphere of influence. At the start of 2023, countries long considered part of the French backyard of France-Afrique like Mali and Burkina Faso fought back, inflicting a new affront on Macron by expelling the French ambassadors in Bamako and Ouagadougou. What were the reasons for this particular decision? Just the latest in a long series of setbacks for France diplomacy in Africa.
France is under heavy fire across its former colonies in Africa. Mali has broken off about 11 accords, including the defense accord. Burkina Faso has also broken off from the double taxation policy that favors France. In Mali, people are protesting on the streets, saying, look, they're tired of France. France should get out. Well, did you foresee this when earlier, or much earlier, you projected that, look, neocolonialism cannot work in Africa and that Africans should be allowed to determine their own destiny? What's your take on the role of France in the crisis, particularly in Niger?
Well, I think the writing has been on the wall for a long time when it comes to France. It was just a matter of time. What's happening now in Africa is a revolution similar to what saw the demise of the mighty Roman Empire, a revolution similar to what we saw with the fall of the mighty British Empire. There is no way that the West would have continued to exploit and plunder African natural resources, abuse the Africans for as long as they have. The end is here, and I hope France does see the writing on the wall. This is just the beginning of the African Revolution, and it is not going to stop. I think that France has gotten away with a lot over the years, and it's not just France, most of the Western powers for that matter. But I would hope that they would see that what's happening in Niger and what has happened in the other countries in West Africa is a very significant movement that I hope the West will look at it and consider it very seriously in terms of their policies on Africa, their foreign policies on Africa. What they have done in the past is simply not going to work anymore.
If you look at the different promises that have been made by the French state, however, before such failures, Emmanuel Macron, then presidential candidate, had made hopeful promises. He spoke of a new partnership, of the end of France-Afrique, of a common future to be charted for both sides of the Mediterranean, and of a future to be offered to the youths of Africa to spare them the perilous adventures of the clandestine migration. But for this to happen, it was necessary to invest massively in Africa, to train, to dare to explore new paths. Macron insisted on being the initiator of the new course by establishing what he considered to be a direct dialogue with those societies through their youths, the civil society, their artists, their intellectuals, their public opinions, and their elites. A few highlighted publicized stages and moments have dotted into the route. In Burkina Faso, in November of 2017, 6 months after his first presidential victory, Macron has descended into an arena of students to debate face-to-face at the university with very upset interlocutors. He also accepted bitter criticism but did not mince his own words. Thus, when asked about visas, he replied to an applicant for immigration that it was more legitimate for him to think about building his future in his country rather than thinking about exile. A few days later, he repeated the same exercise in Ghana, affirming that Europe must have a policy of cooperation so that a young African can tell himself that he is going to succeed in his own country rather than dreaming of an ex-European El Dorado. According to him, saying that the speech was courageous and daring, but Macron had neither the means nor the instrument nor the partners to carry out those projects. Moreover, Macron's speech revealed a denial of reality that it's difficult to understand at his level of responsibility. In terms of security in the Sahel, for example, Macron highlighted the French efforts of Operation Barkhane to counter jihadists in the region. The jihadist surge was largely the consequences of the destruction of the Libyan state following the 2011 NATO intervention, in which the France of Nicolas Sarkozy played a central role.
Emmanuel Macron, speaking in Gabon on Thursday, said France has no intention of returning to its past policies of interfering in Africa. The French president arrived in Libreville on Wednesday at the start of a four-nation tour aimed at resetting relations with the continent.
When I
read here and see that people still attribute to France intentions that it does not have, that it no longer has, people also seem to be expecting it to take positions that it refuses to take, and I fully accept this. This is why I prefer to be very clear and explicit in meeting you today. In Gabon, as elsewhere, France is a neutral interlocutor which speaks to everyone and whose role is not to interfere in domestic political issues. His visit comes as anti-French sentiment runs high in some of its former colonies in the Sahel region and follows the launch of Paris's new Africa policy. I've decided on a new strategy for all our military bases in Africa, and I've asked the Defence Minister and the Chief of the Defence Staff to work with their counterparts to adapt our military arrangements. This is neither a withdrawal nor a disengagement, but a question of adapting a system so that, firstly, it's based on a reformulation of needs.
Previously, the countries of the region had suffered a century of colonization, followed by half a century of France-Afrique. What benefits did they actually derive from it? Some of them, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and also Central African Republic, still sitting high on the list of the poorest countries in the world. With such a disastrous past, what interest do they have in remaining under the supposed protection of France, especially since, apart from a fake also discourse on the democracy and human rights, France, including under Macron, does not hesitate to deal with regimes that do not meet democratic criteria. French diplomacy is indeed more sensitive to the real interest of France, including economic interests, that is so moral principles and noble causes. This implies that France must develop and maintain a rapport with foreign leaders who hardly accept the democratic canons praised by Macron himself, leaders who must be spur in order, for example, to preserve the French presence in Chad or French nuclear industry that relies on the uranium from Niger. This erroneous perception of African realities pushed the French head of state to look for scapegoats to explain his setbacks in Africa. He thus ended up developing a kind of fixation, even a phobia about the Chinese, Russia, and Turkish presence in Africa. Relayed by most of the French media, Macron's speeches respectively warned against plundering of Africa by China, the attempt at Russian hegemony, or even the negative influence of Turkey. A futile and pitfall discourse in the facts of reality has then been a more intense looting of West Africa than that of colonial and neo-colonial France, a more destructive hegemony than the French hegemony, a more harmful influence than that of France. Even the discourse on the dangers of the presence of troops from the Russian Wagner Group is totally ineffective. Historically, the French army remains the foreign military force from which Africa has suffered the most. Brandishing a virtual Russian threat cannot hide the real legacy of the past. This is why the President of France has failed in his pursuit with regards to renewing the relationship with regards to these particular African options in dealing with Francophone Africa and the African continent at large.
Maloney is a deeply principled politician who has a habit of telling it like it is. Watch here as she explains how France continues to exploit poor African countries, which then adds to Europe's illegal immigration crisis.
Questo è un bambino che lavora in una miniera d'oro in Burkina Faso. Il Burkina Faso è una delle nazioni più povere del mondo. Per il Burkina Faso, che ha l'oro, la Francia stampa moneta coloniale. In cambio pretende che finiscano nelle casse del tesoro francese il 50% di tutto quello che il Burkina Faso esporta. L'oro che questo bambino si infila in un cunicolo per tirare fuori finisce per lo più nelle casse dello Stato francese. Allora la soluzione non è prendere gli africani e spostarli in Europa, la soluzione è liberare l'Africa da certi europei che la sfruttano e consentire a queste persone di vivere di quello che hanno.
She said the solution is not to take the Africans and bring them to Europe. The solution is to free Africa from certain Europeans who exploit it.
Moving forward, if you consider the two audiences that the country of France is facing at the moment, in addition to his own contradictions, Mr. Macron had come up against pitfalls, both internal and external, that he did not suspect. There is a hostility of the powers in place who can no longer accept the attempt of a foreign leader to address directly their public opinion by bypassing the government and also its institution. Some countries have nevertheless agreed to play the game. Macron then found himself confronted with two types of public. The first conquered was the composed of Francophile circle, business circles with which vested interest and also the visa applicants. The other, the most numerous, was the skeptical and even hostile. That second audience found itself critically expression in the recrimination of nationalist, Africanist, pan-Arabist and also Islamist movement or milieu, sometimes openly anti-French and very widespread in those particular societies. The appearance of new Africanist circles navigating between radicalism and also popularism, such that by the Franco-Beninese Kemi Seba, the president of the NGO Eugène Pan-Africanist, further complicated the picture. However, how can we explain this series of errors of appreciation and the lack of foresight on the part of the President of France? The French head of state seemed to have been seduced by intellectuals and also activists with a strong presence in the media world. Looking forward in looking at the particular legacy, he also entrusted one of them, Achille Mbembe, with the Dire initiative, a meeting with African elite to circumvent the traditional Franc-Afrique Summit. But that approach had no impact. Macron managed to attain the sympathy of some circles of renowned intellectuals, but these also with no political or social anchorage in looking at altering unrepresentative of their own society. The real legacy itself regards to France's own perspective, more down to earth. The President Macron also found himself confronted with the reluctance, even hostile, of the traditional French diplomacy embodied by the Qui au Ose.
But I'd like to ask you this. Has the revolution truly begun? Is Africa really free? Africa, since we got independent, since most nations got independent in the 1960s, to 1990 have over 110 coups. Is that not the same movement without action or movement without purpose that we are going through? That we are mistaking for a revolution? That's one to you, man.
I see what's happening in Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea very differently. If you look at the previous coups, those were orchestrated by Western powers, majority, of course, orchestrated by France. They had their own intentions, in a few quite documented very well. The leaders were trying to do what was ultimately best for their people, and those leaders were assassinated. The difference between these coups are coups being led by our people. The people have spoken. The people now truly understand the issues. The people are standing up to say what has been going on is unfair, is unacceptable. It really just simply makes sense that something has got to give. There is a difference between the previous coups and these last 4 coups, especially the one in Niger. I actually, on a personal level, I feel uncomfortable even calling them coups. This is you look at a situation where people are basically desperate, where they know they're rich in natural resources, and yet the majority of the people are extremely poor. How long can that situation be sustained before the people finally wake up and rise up? That is what's happening. And I would like to call what's happening in these 4 countries as an ideological realignment of their economic, of their political, of their social values. At some point, if you look at the situation with the former French colonies, before even a president comes to power, there are certain no-go areas that the president must not touch, because if you do, you may not live to see the end of the day. Areas like the military, areas like, of course, the finances and the reserves that must be deposited with the French treasury, areas of the natural resources. So if you are a president, an African president, who is coming to power, and you are told, as long as you stay away from discussions pertaining to their presence, military presence in the country, training of your military by France, equipping of your military by France, don't talk about the natural resources, whose the French companies have the first right of approval. Do not talk, and make sure you continue to deposit your bank reserves with the French central bank. If you avoid those areas, then you're free to run your country any which way you want. Now, what kind of a leader is that? What environment are you going to be occupying and managing and running your country with all those major areas of economic development no longer accessible to you? The whole thing is so mind-boggling that we have gone to, over so many years, this is 2023, that the leaders in Africa have been unable to undo the agreements that were put in place when the African countries were given their independence. It is unbelievable that to this day, you can have a country like Niger to be the second poorest country in the world, and yet all their resources are going to France. Most of Niger is not electrified, while their uranium is electrifying France and Europe. You can take one after the other. At every level, it's unfair, It's unacceptable, and I don't even know how the Western powers could really go to sleep every day knowing of the carnage that the havoc they're creating in Africa, and hope that this will go on forever. The time has come. The children of Africa are now awoken. They can see clearly now, and they're simply standing up and saying, enough is enough. So yes, we don't like coups, but the last 4 coups are very different in the sense that the children of Africa are very clear, because they are the ones standing up and saying, we got to take back our country. We need to defend our turf. What's right is right. What is wrong is wrong. We can no longer continue to be exploited. That's what makes this different. It's not influenced by France. The coups are not influenced by any nation. It's simply people standing back and saying, we're taking back what belongs to us.
Hopefully we've informed you with regards to the reason why President Macron's crusade to renew France's role in Africa had failed, and let us know if you think that it's going to be a challenge for the French state to be able to reinstate itself in the region, looking at the interest of Russia, the United States, European Union, and also other countries like China who are currently competing for positions in the region. Want to thank you for watching. Looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.